The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine corridors of the Galactic Academy, its crystalline walls reflecting the light in patterns that would have mesmerized any human eye. But Marcus Chen wasn't paying attention to the architecture. He was too busy trying not to trip over his own feet as he hurried toward advanced theoretical physics, his worn leather satchel bouncing against his hip with each hurried step. At 17, Marcus was already an anomaly at the Academy. Humans had only been part of the Galactic Federation for 15 years, and they were still considered the newest, least advanced species in the collective. Most human students didn't even qualify for the basic programs, let alone the advanced courses that Marcus had somehow managed to test into. The fact that he was here at all was a source of constant whispers and sideways glances from his alien classmates. The classroom door hissed open as Marcus slipped inside, hoping to find a seat in the back before Professor Zekthera noticed his arrival. No such luck. The Vorthack professor's 4 eyes swiveled toward him in unison, each one reflecting a different shade of disappointment. "Ah, the human finally graces us with his presence," Zekthera's voice carried that particular tone that made Marcus's skin crawl. It wasn't quite mockery, but it wasn't respect either. "Please, take your seat. We were just discussing quantum entanglement theory, though I suspect the concepts may be somewhat challenging for your species to grasp." A few snickers rippled through the classroom. Marcus recognized the sound well by now. The KRYLL students, with their crystalline bodies that literally sang when they found something amusing. The Nexari twins, whose tentacles writhed in what Marcus had learned was their equivalent of laughter. Even Jorik, the normally stoic Threnodite student, seemed to be suppressing what might have been a smile behind his scaled features. Marcus took his usual seat in the third row, pulled out his tablet, and tried to ignore the burning in his cheeks. He'd been dealing with this for months now, ever since he'd arrived at the academy. The constant reminders that humans were the junior species. The barely concealed amusement when he asked questions. The assumption that anything he didn't understand immediately was due to the inherent limitations of his primitive human brain. "Now then," Professor Zekthera continued, his elongated fingers dancing across the holographic display that materialized in the center of the room, "who can explain the fundamental paradox of quantum entanglement when applied to faster-than-light communication?" Several hands shot up immediately. Veltar, a KRYLL whose crystalline structure glowed with confidence. Cyrash, a Nexari whose tentacles practically vibrated with eagerness. Even young Thix, barely old enough to be at the academy by Gorneth standards, raised one of his multiple arms. Professor Zekthera's eyes swept the room, pausing deliberately on each raised hand before settling on Marcus. "Mr. Chen, perhaps you'd like to take a stab at this? Though I understand if it's beyond your current comprehension level." The classroom fell silent. Marcus could feel every eye in the room focused on him, waiting for him to fumble, to prove once again that humans simply weren't ready for this level of academic rigor. He'd been in this position before, and usually he just mumbled something about needing more time to study, which would earn him another condescending nod from the professor and more snickers from his classmates. But today felt different. Maybe it was the way Zekthera had emphasized your species, as if Marcus's entire civilization was somehow deficient. Maybe it was the particularly smug expression on Veltar's glowing face. Or maybe Marcus was just tired of being treated like an intellectual charity case. "The paradox," Marcus said, his voice steadier than he felt, "isn't actually a paradox at all. It's a misunderstanding of the relationship between quantum entanglement and information transfer." The snickering stopped. Professor Zekthera's 4 eyes narrowed slightly, but he gestured for Marcus to continue. "Quantum entanglement doesn't allow for faster-than-light communication because measuring one particle doesn't transmit information to its entangled partner. When you observe an entangled particle, you get a random result. The correlation only becomes apparent when you compare measurements after the fact, using conventional, slower-than-light communication." Veltar's glow dimmed slightly. Cyrash's tentacles stopped moving entirely. Even Thix lowered his raised arm. "The real question," Marcus continued, gaining confidence, "isn't how to use entanglement for FTL communication, but whether the correlation exists because of hidden variables we haven't discovered yet, or if reality truly is non-local in the way that Bell's theorem suggests." Professor Zekthera was quiet for a long moment. His 4 eyes studied Marcus with an intensity that made the human student want to sink into his chair. Around the room, Marcus could hear the soft whispers of his classmates, their voices carrying notes of surprise and, from a few, what might have been grudging respect. That is. Professor Zekthara paused, as if choosing his words carefully, a more sophisticated answer than I was expecting. Though I notice you're referencing work by human theorists. Perhaps you could explain the concept using established galactic physics principles instead of your species' more primitive approaches? The burning in Marcus's cheeks returned, but now it was anger rather than embarrassment. Bell's theorem isn't primitive. It's fundamental to quantum mechanics, regardless of which species discovered it. The math doesn't change based on whether a human or a Vorthak wrote it down first. A collective gasp went through the classroom. No one spoke to Professor Zekthara that way. The Vorthak were one of the founding species of the Galactic Federation. Their understanding of theoretical physics was legendary throughout known space. For a human student to suggest that his species' work was on par with theirs was unprecedented. Professor Zekthara's 4 eyes seemed to burn with indignation. Mr. Chen, I think you're forgetting your place. The Vorthak have been studying quantum mechanics for over 2 millennia while your species was still discovering fire. Perhaps a little humility would serve you better than this display of arrogance. I'm not being arrogant, Marcus replied, though his voice was shaking now. I'm being accurate. Quantum mechanics works the same way whether you're human or Vorthak or KRYLL or anything else. Physics doesn't care about politics or how long a civilization has existed. The professor's face darkened, his skin shifting to the deep purple that Marcus had learned indicated serious displeasure in Vorthak physiology. Your primitive understanding of these concepts is showing, Mr. Chen. Perhaps you'd benefit from returning to a more basic physics course, one better suited to your species' intellectual capabilities. That did it. Marcus stood up, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that echoed through the suddenly silent classroom. My understanding isn't primitive. You're just upset that I'm right and, you know it. Bell's inequality violations have been confirmed by experiments across dozens of species, including yours. The Copenhagen interpretation, many worlds theory, hidden variable theories, these aren't human concepts, they're universal principles that any sufficiently advanced civilization would discover. Professor Zekthara stepped forward, his considerable height allowing him to loom over Marcus even from the front of the classroom. That is quite enough, Mr. Chen. Your behavior today has been completely unacceptable. Perhaps it's time the Academy reconsidered whether humans are truly ready for advanced education, or if you need a few more centuries to develop the intellectual and emotional maturity required for serious academic discourse. Around the room, Marcus could see his classmates watching with a mixture of fascination and horror. This kind of confrontation simply didn't happen at the Academy. Students, especially students from junior species, didn't challenge professors. They certainly didn't suggest that their professors were wrong about fundamental scientific principles. Marcus felt his hands trembling, but he didn't sit down. You can question my behavior, Professor, but you can't question the science. And if the Academy wants to kick out students for being right about physics, then maybe the problem isn't with the students. The silence that followed was deafening. Professor Zekthara's face had gone beyond purple into a shade that Marcus didn't even have a name for. Several of his classmates looked like they were preparing to duck under their desks, as if they expected the professor to literally explode. Get out, Professor Zekthara said, his voice low and dangerous. Get out of my classroom immediately. And report to Principal Mordak's office. We'll see what she has to say about your attitude, Mr. Chen. Marcus grabbed his satchel and headed for the door, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. As he reached the threshold, he turned back one last time. For what it's worth, Professor, he said quietly, I really do respect the Vorthak contributions to science. I just wish you'd show the same respect for everyone else's. The door hissed shut behind him, leaving Marcus alone in the corridor with the awful realization of what he'd just done. He'd essentially told one of the most respected professors at the Academy that he was wrong. In front of a classroom full of witnesses. And now he had to explain himself to Principal Mordak, who was legendary for her strict adherence to Academy protocol and her particular dislike of disruptions. Marcus slumped against the crystalline wall and tried to catch his breath. Maybe Professor Zekthara was right. Maybe humans weren't ready for this level of education. Maybe Marcus had just proved that his entire species was too immature, too arrogant, too primitive for the Galactic Academy. But, even as doubt crept into his mind, Marcus couldn't shake the conviction that he'd been right about the science. Bell's theorem was Bell's theorem, regardless of who had discovered it or when. Physics was universal, and the math didn't lie. The question now was whether Principal Mordack would see it that way, or whether Marcus's time at the academy was about to come to an abrupt and humiliating end. With leaden steps, Marcus began the long walk to the principal's office, trying to prepare himself for what might be the most important conversation of his academic career. Behind him, the muffled sounds of continuing class discussion filtered through the door, but Marcus couldn't quite bring himself to wonder what his classmates were saying about him. He had bigger problems to worry about now. The Academy's administrative wing was notoriously intimidating, designed to remind visitors of the weight of galactic authority and the importance of proper behavior. As Marcus walked through corridors lined with portraits of distinguished alumni from across the galaxy, he couldn't help but notice that there wasn't a single human face among them. When he finally reached Principal Mordack's office, her secretary, a Gornoth with the unfortunate habit of clicking his mandibles when he was annoyed, looked up from his desk with obvious displeasure. "Marcus Chen," the secretary said, consulting his display. "Yes, Professor Zekthera has already contacted us. Principal Mordack will see you shortly. Please have a seat and consider using this time to reflect on your behavior." Marcus sat in one of the chairs that had clearly been designed for someone much larger than a human, his feet barely touching the floor, and tried to organize his thoughts. "How exactly did you explain to the principal of the most prestigious educational institution in the galaxy that you'd challenged a professor because you were right and he was wrong? How did you make that sound like anything other than the desperate excuse of an arrogant student who couldn't accept correction?" The answer, Marcus realized with growing dread, was that you probably couldn't. The principal. The door to Principal Mordack's office slid open with a soft whisper, and Marcus found himself face to face with the most intimidating individual he'd ever encountered. Principal Mordack was a Zephyrian, standing nearly 3 meters tall, with skin that shifted between deep blue and silver depending on the light. Her 6 arms moved with fluid precision as she gestured for Marcus to enter, and her large, multifaceted eyes seemed to see everything at once. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated in frequencies Marcus could feel in his bones. "Please, sit down." Marcus took the chair across from her massive desk, feeling even smaller than he had in the waiting area. The office itself was a study in understated power, walls lined with certificates and awards from a dozen different worlds, a collection of rare crystals that hummed with barely contained energy, and a viewport that offered a stunning view of the Academy's sprawling campus and the city beyond. Principal Mordack settled into her chair, which adjusted automatically to accommodate her considerable frame. She steepled 4 of her hands while the other 2 operated a holographic display that Marcus couldn't quite see from his angle. "Professor Zekthera has filed a formal complaint regarding your behavior in his advanced theoretical physics class," she began, her tone neutral but carrying an undertone of authority that made Marcus want to shrink into his chair. "He states that you were disruptive, disrespectful, and displayed an alarming level of arrogance inappropriate for a student, particularly one from a junior species." Marcus swallowed hard. "Principal Mordack, I can explain." One of her hands rose, and Marcus fell silent immediately. "I'm not finished, Mr. Chen. Professor Zekthera also states that you challenged established scientific principles with what he describes as primitive human theories and that you showed complete disregard for proper academic hierarchy and respect." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. When laid out like that, his behavior did sound inexcusable. He could already imagine the report going back to Earth, the disappointment from his parents, the vindication that critics of the human space program would feel when they learned that their first advanced student had flamed out spectacularly. However, Principal Mordack continued, and something in her tone made Marcus look up sharply. "Professor Zekthera's complaint lacks certain details that I find concerning. He doesn't specify exactly what scientific principles you challenged, or what theories you presented. He simply states that you were wrong and disrespectful." Marcus felt a flicker of hope. "Ma'am, before you speak, Mr. Chen, I want you to understand something very important." Principal Mordack leaned forward, her multifaceted eyes fixing on Marcus with an intensity that made him feel like she could read his thoughts. The Galactic Academy exists to advance knowledge and understanding throughout known space. We bring together the brightest minds from every member species not to maintain some arbitrary hierarchy, but to push the boundaries of what we know and what we can achieve together. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. With that in mind, I want you to tell me, in your own words, exactly what happened in Professor Zekthara's classroom today. And I want you to be completely honest, because I will be reviewing the classroom recordings after our conversation. Marcus felt his mouth go dry. There were recordings? Of course there were recordings. The Academy monitored all classes for quality control and dispute resolution. Which meant Principal Mordak would be able to see exactly what had happened, hear every word that had been spoken. Ma'am, Marcus began, his voice barely above a whisper. Professor Zekthara asked about quantum entanglement paradoxes. I answered that it wasn't actually a paradox, just a misunderstanding about information transfer. When he asked me to explain using established galactic principles instead of human theories, I said that physics doesn't change based on which species discovers it first. Principal Mordak nodded slowly. And then? He said humans were primitive, and that I was arrogant for thinking our understanding was equal to the Vorthok. I told him that quantum mechanics works the same way regardless of species, and that Bell's theorem has been confirmed by experiments across the galaxy. Bell's theorem, Principal Mordak repeated thoughtfully. You're referring to the mathematical proof regarding local hidden variable theories and quantum entanglement? Marcus nodded, surprised that she knew it. Yes, ma'am. The inequality violations show that either locality or realism has to be false in quantum mechanics. It's been confirmed experimentally by dozens of species, including the Vorthok themselves. For a long moment, Principal Mordak was silent. Her 6 hands moved across various controls, and Marcus realized she was pulling up information on her displays. The quiet stretched out until Marcus began to wonder if he was supposed to say something else. Mr. Chen, she finally said, are you familiar with the work of Dr. Kathmora? The name meant nothing to Marcus. No, ma'am. Dr. Kathmora was a Vorthok physicist who lived approximately 300 years ago. He proposed what he called the universal correlation principle, the idea that certain quantum measurements would show instantaneous correlation regardless of distance, and that this correlation could not be explained by any hidden variable theory. Marcus felt his heart start to race. That sounds like, yes, Principal Mordak continued, it sounds remarkably similar to what your species calls Bell's theorem. Dr. Kathmora's work was groundbreaking for its time, and it has indeed been confirmed by experiments conducted by virtually every spacefaring species in the galaxy. The implications hit Marcus like a thunderbolt. So when Professor Zekthara said I was using primitive human theories instead of established galactic principles, he was demonstrating a troubling ignorance of his own species' scientific history, Principal Mordak finished. As well as an unfortunate prejudice regarding human contributions to universal knowledge. Marcus stared at her, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. You mean I was right? Principal Mordak's expression was unreadable, but Marcus thought he detected something that might have been approval in her multifaceted eyes. Mr. Chen, the specific mathematical relationships you described are fundamental to quantum mechanics as understood throughout the galaxy. The fact that humans independently discovered these principles, despite being relative newcomers to space travel, is actually quite remarkable. But, Professor Zekthara said many things, according to the preliminary report I've received. Some of them were accurate assessments of your behavior, which was indeed inappropriate for a classroom setting. Others were. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Let's say they reflected poorly on his commitment to objective scientific discourse. Marcus felt a complex mixture of vindication and guilt. He'd been right about the science, but he'd also been disrespectful to a professor in front of an entire class. Ma'am, I know I shouldn't have argued with him like that. I should have found a more appropriate way to express my disagreement. Yes, you should have, Principal Mordak agreed. Academic discourse requires a certain level of decorum, regardless of how strongly you may disagree with a particular position. However, she leaned back in her chair, and Marcus noticed that her skin had shifted to a more silver tone. Your frustration is understandable, given the circumstances. She activated another display, and Marcus could see what appeared to be a collection of reports and evaluations. Mr. Chen, are you aware that your academic performance here has been exceptional? Your test scores place you in the top 5% of all students, across all species. Your research proposals show remarkable creativity and insight. Your professors, with one notable exception, have consistently praised your dedication and intellectual curiosity. Marcus blinked in surprise. They have? Dr. Silthara in Advanced Mathematics describes your approach to multidimensional calculus as refreshingly intuitive. Professor Gyx Nath in Comparative Xenobiology notes that your questions often reveal assumptions that other students, and occasionally even faculty, have never thought to challenge. And Dr. Velshannon in Theoretical Engineering says that your final project proposal for quantum-scale manufacturing represents some of the most innovative thinking she's seen in decades. The word seemed surreal to Marcus. For months, he'd felt like he was barely keeping up, like he was constantly proving that humans didn't belong among the galaxy's elite students. To learn that his professors actually thought highly of his work was almost overwhelming. Then, why, Marcus asked quietly, does Professor Zekthara treat me like I'm an intellectual charity case? Principal Mordak was quiet for a moment, her 6 hands stilled. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested she was sharing something significant. Mr. Chen, the Galactic Federation represents an unprecedented experiment in cooperation between species with vastly different evolutionary backgrounds, cultural traditions, and technological capabilities. For the most part, this experiment has been remarkably successful. We've achieved scientific breakthroughs that no single species could have accomplished alone, established peaceful relationships across thousands of light years, and created institutions like this academy that truly serve the common good. She paused, and Marcus sensed there was a but coming. But success doesn't eliminate all prejudices, and institutional authority doesn't automatically confer wisdom. Some individuals, regardless of their species or academic credentials, find it difficult to accept that intelligence and insight can emerge from unexpected sources. Like humans, Marcus said. Like any species that challenges preconceived notions about intellectual hierarchy, Principal Mordak corrected gently. The Vorthak were once dismissed by the KRYLL as upstart mammals who would never understand the crystalline mathematics that the KRYLL considered the only true form of scientific thought. The Nexari were told by virtually everyone that their collective consciousness made individual brilliance impossible. Even my own people, the Zephyrians, were once considered too ethereal and philosophical for practical scientific work. Marcus began to understand. And now it's humans who are the newcomers. Exactly. Professor Zekthara's attitude toward your species is unfortunately not unique, though it is becoming increasingly uncommon as human contributions to science become more widely recognized. Your presence here, your success, represents a challenge to his worldview. Rather than adapting that worldview to accommodate new evidence, he's chosen to dismiss the evidence as invalid. Which is pretty unscientific, Marcus observed. Principal Mordak's skin shifted to what Marcus was learning might be the Zephyrian equivalent of a smile. Indeed. And that brings us to the question of what happens next. Marcus felt his stomach clench. Here it came, the expulsion, the end of his dreams, the confirmation that humans really weren't ready for this level of education. Professor Zekthara has demanded that you be removed from his class and placed in remedial coursework more appropriate to your species' developmental level, Principal Mordak continued. He's also suggested that your admission to the academy was premature and that you should be sent back to Earth for several more years of basic education. The words hit Marcus harder than he'd expected. Even though he'd been bracing for this possibility, hearing it stated so bluntly made it real in a way that frightened him. However, Principal Mordak continued, and, again that word carried hope, I have a different perspective on the situation. She stood up, her considerable height making the office seem suddenly smaller, and walked to the viewport that looked out over the academy grounds. For a moment, she stood silently, and Marcus wondered what she was thinking. Mr. Chen, she finally said, what do you believe the purpose of education should be? The question caught Marcus off guard. I think education should help people understand the world around them. Help them ask better questions and find better answers. And, should education reinforce existing hierarchies, or should it challenge students and faculty alike to grow beyond their current limitations? Marcus sensed this was a crucial moment, that his answer might determine his entire future at the academy. It should challenge everyone to grow. Knowledge doesn't care about hierarchies. Principal Mordak turned back to face him, and Marcus was certain now that her shifting skin color indicated approval. That, Mr. Chen, is precisely the right answer. She returned to her desk and began manipulating her displays again. Professor Zekthara is a brilliant physicist and has made significant contributions to our understanding of quantum field theory. However, his pedagogical methods have become outdated. Rather than removing you from his class, I believe the situation calls for a different approach. Marcus leaned forward, hardly daring to hope. What kind of approach? The Academy has a long-standing tradition of academic freedom and open scientific discourse. When disagreements arise regarding scientific principles, we don't simply defer to authority, we examine the evidence and let the data guide our conclusions. She pulled up a new display, and Marcus could see what appeared to be an official Academy form. I'm scheduling a formal academic review of the quantum entanglement discussion that took place in Professor Zekthara's class today. You'll present your position regarding Bell's theorem and its relationship to what Professor Zekthara calls established galactic principles. He'll present his counterargument. A panel of distinguished faculty from multiple species will evaluate both presentations and determine the scientific accuracy of each position. Marcus felt his heart pounding. A formal review? Think of it as a scientific debate with actual stakes, Principal Mordak explained. If your position is upheld, Professor Zekthara will be required to formally acknowledge the validity of human contributions to quantum mechanics and to adjust his teaching methods accordingly. If his position is upheld. She didn't need to finish. Marcus understood that his entire future at the Academy would be on the line. Ma'am, Marcus said carefully, what if I'm wrong? What if there's something I don't understand about galactic physics that makes Bell's theorem irrelevant here? Principal Mordak's multifaceted eyes seemed to sparkle. Then, you'll learn something new, which is the entire point of being here. But, Mr. Chen, I've been the principal of this academy for over 30 years. I've seen brilliant students from dozens of species, and I've watched the evolution of scientific understanding across the galaxy. I have considerable confidence in your position. You do? The mathematics don't lie, Mr. Chen. And, more importantly, the Academy was founded on the principle that truth transcends species prejudice. If we're going to uphold that principle, we need to be willing to defend it when it matters. Marcus felt a surge of gratitude toward this imposing alien administrator who was giving him a chance to prove himself rather than simply accepting Professor Zekthara's dismissal. But, he also felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. When will the review take place, he asked. 1 week from today. That will give you time to prepare your presentation and review the relevant literature from across the galaxy. It will also give Professor Zekthara time to reconsider his position, should he choose to do so. Principal Mordak stood again, signaling that their meeting was coming to an end. Mr. Chen, I want you to understand that this is about much more than one student's academic standing or one professor's wounded pride. The Academy's commitment to scientific truth and academic freedom is being tested here. How we handle this situation will send a message to students and faculty throughout the galaxy about what we truly value. Marcus stood as well, his legs feeling somewhat unsteady. I understand, ma'am. I won't let you down. You've already exceeded my expectations simply by standing up for scientific truth, even when it was difficult to do so, Principal Mordak replied. Now you need to prove that your convictions are backed by solid evidence and rigorous reasoning. As Marcus turned to leave, Principal Mordak called his name one last time. Mr. Chen? For what it's worth, I believe that diversity of thought and background makes us stronger, not weaker. Your presence here isn't just about giving humans a chance, it's about making sure the Academy lives up to its founding principles. Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice, and headed for the door. As it slid closed behind him, he realized that his life had just become infinitely more complicated. In 1 week, he would either vindicate humanity's place among the galaxy's intellectual elite or confirm every prejudice that critics held about his species. But, as he walked through the Academy's corridors, past the portraits of distinguished alumni and the impressive displays of scientific achievement, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in months: genuine hope. He had a chance to prove that truth mattered more than tradition, that scientific accuracy trumped academic hierarchy. Now he just had to make sure he was actually right about the science. Because if he wasn't, the consequences would extend far beyond his own academic career. #The Vindication. The Academy's Grand Auditorium had never felt more imposing to Marcus than it did on the morning of the formal review. The vast chamber, designed to accommodate representatives from dozens of different species, stretched out before him like an amphitheater of judgment. Crystalline pillars supported a dome that seemed to stretch into infinity, and the air itself hummed with the energy fields that allowed beings with vastly different atmospheric requirements to coexist in the same space. Marcus stood at the presenter's podium, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his notes one final time. The past week had been a blur of intensive research, sleepless nights, and growing anxiety. He'd combed through scientific databases from across the galaxy, cross-referenced mathematical proofs in dozens of different notation systems, and even reached out to human physicists back on Earth for additional perspectives on Bell's theorem and its implications. What he'd discovered had been both reassuring and humbling. Not only was his understanding of quantum mechanics sound, but humans had indeed made significant contributions to the field that were recognized and built upon by scientists throughout the galaxy. The problem wasn't with human science, it was with certain individuals who refused to acknowledge scientific truth when it didn't align with their preconceptions about species hierarchy. The review panel had been assembled with care to ensure fairness and expertise. Dr. Yulnara, a KRYLL physicist whose work on crystalline computing had revolutionized information processing. Professor Thainsov, a Nexary collective intelligence expert who had helped develop the theoretical framework for quantum consciousness research. Commander Veldrak, a Threnodine military scientist whose practical applications of quantum mechanics had led to breakthroughs in defensive technology. And, chairing the panel, Dr. Morthek, a elderly Gornath whose work on unified field theory was legendary throughout known space. In the audience, Marcus could see his classmates from Professor Zekthara's class, their expressions ranging from curious to skeptical. Other students had come as well, drawn by rumors of an unprecedented challenge to faculty authority. Even some professors were in attendance, though Marcus wasn't sure if they were there to support him or to witness his anticipated failure. Professor Zekthara sat in the front row, his four eyes fixed on Marcus with an expression of barely concealed contempt. He'd made it clear throughout the past week that he considered this entire proceeding a waste of time and an unfortunate indulgence of student arrogance. His presentation, scheduled to follow Marcus's, would undoubtedly emphasize the importance of academic hierarchy and the dangers of allowing junior species to challenge established authority. Principal Mordak occupied a seat at the side of the auditorium, her massive frame somehow managing to look both supportive and intimidating. She'd made it clear that she expected Marcus to present his case with the same rigor and professionalism that would be demanded of any doctoral candidate defending their thesis. The informal nature of the classroom discussion was long past. This was serious academic discourse with real consequences. Ladies, gentlemen, and honored collective entities, Dr. Morthek's voice boomed through the auditorium, enhanced by translation fields that ensured every being present could understand regardless of their native language. We are gathered today to address a fundamental question about the nature of scientific truth and its relationship to academic authority. The Gornatha's multitudinous eyes turned toward Marcus. Mr. Chen, you have claimed that certain principles of quantum mechanics, as understood by human science, are universal truths that transcend species-specific approaches to physics. You have 30 minutes to present evidence supporting this claim. Marcus took a deep breath and activated the holographic display system. Immediately, mathematical equations appeared in the air above his head, rendered in the standardized notation that had been adopted across the galaxy to facilitate scientific communication between species. Honorable panel members and distinguished colleagues, Marcus began, his voice steadier than he felt. Today I will demonstrate that the mathematical relationships first formalized by the human physicist John Stuart Bell are not merely human theories, but fundamental descriptions of quantum mechanical reality that have been independently discovered and verified by multiple species throughout the galaxy. He gestured to the first set of equations. These are Bell's inequalities as originally formulated by human mathematics. They describe the maximum correlation that can exist between measurements on separated particles if those particles carry predetermined properties, what we call local hidden variables. Marcus paused, looking out at the audience. Several of his classmates were leaning forward, genuinely engaged with the presentation. Even Professor Zekthera seemed to be paying attention, though his expression remained skeptical. However, Marcus continued, experimental measurements consistently violate these inequalities, proving that either locality or realism must be false in quantum mechanics. This is not a human interpretation or a species-specific understanding, it's a mathematical fact that any civilization with sufficient technological capability will inevitably discover. He manipulated the holographic display, and new equations appeared alongside the original ones. These are the same mathematical relationships as described by the Vorthack physicist Dr. Keth-Mora in his universal correlation principle, developed approximately 300 years ago. A murmur went through the audience. Marcus saw Professor Zekthera's four eyes widen in surprise. Apparently he hadn't been familiar with Dr. Keth-Mora's work, despite being a member of the same species. Here, Marcus continued, highlighting specific portions of both sets of equations, we can see that Dr. Keth-Mora's mathematical formulation is identical to Bell's theorem in all essential respects. The notation is different, the cultural context is different, but the underlying mathematical truth is the same. Marcus advanced to the next display, which showed a complex chart mapping scientific discoveries across multiple species and time periods. This pattern repeats throughout the galaxy. The KRYLL discovered these relationships during their investigations into crystalline information storage. The Nexari Collective encountered them while exploring quantum consciousness. The Threnody military identified them during weapons research. The Zephyrians found them in their studies of interdimensional physics. He gestured to the chart, where convergent discoveries were highlighted in bright colors. Different species, different motivations, different technological approaches, but the same fundamental mathematical relationships. This isn't coincidence, it's evidence that these principles describe objective reality rather than species-specific interpretation. Dr. Yilnara, the KRYLL panel member, spoke up. Mr. Chen, are you suggesting that scientific truth is truly universal, independent of the cultural and biological differences between species? That's exactly what I'm suggesting, Marcus replied confidently. Mathematics doesn't care about our cultural backgrounds or our evolutionary history. The universe operates according to consistent physical laws, and any sufficiently advanced civilization will discover the same fundamental relationships. But, surely, Professor Thanesoth interjected, there must be species-specific insights that lead to different understandings of these phenomena? Marcus nodded enthusiastically. Absolutely. Different species bring different perspectives and methodologies to scientific research, and those differences are incredibly valuable. The KRYLL's crystalline approach to information theory has led to computational breakthroughs that other species never would have conceived. The Nexari collective consciousness research has opened entirely new fields of quantum mechanics. He manipulated the display again, showing how different species had built upon the fundamental principles to develop unique applications and insights. But, the underlying mathematical relationships, the basic facts about how quantum mechanics works, those are the same regardless of who discovers them. The value of diversity isn't that different species find different truths, but that they find different ways to explore and apply the same universal truths. Commander Veldrak leaned forward in his seat. Mr. Chen, you're making a significant claim about the nature of scientific authority. Are you suggesting that academic hierarchy should be irrelevant to scientific discourse? This was the moment Marcus had been preparing for all week. Commander, I'm suggesting that scientific truth should be evaluated based on evidence and mathematical rigor, not on the species, age, or institutional status of whoever presents it. The Academy's own charter states that knowledge serves the common good of all Federation species. How can that be true if we discount scientific contributions based on prejudices about which species are advanced enough to make meaningful discoveries? Marcus pulled up a new display showing the Academy's founding principles, their words glowing in the air above his head. When the Academy was established, the founders recognized that scientific progress required the free exchange of ideas between species with vastly different backgrounds and perspectives. They understood that truth could emerge from unexpected sources, and that institutional authority should serve truth rather than the other way around. He looked directly at Professor Zekthara. Professor, you've made significant contributions to quantum field theory that have advanced our understanding throughout the galaxy. Your work is respected and cited by scientists from dozens of species. But scientific authority comes from the quality of your contributions, not from your species or how long your civilization has been studying physics. Professor Zekthara's face had shifted to that deep purple that indicated serious displeasure in Vorthak physiology. Mr. Chen, you're displaying exactly the kind of arrogance that I warned about. You're a first-year student from a species that has barely begun to explore space, and you're presuming to lecture your professors about the nature of scientific truth. Marcus felt his heart racing, but he forced himself to remain calm. Professor, I'm not lecturing anyone. I'm presenting evidence that supports a specific scientific position. The fact that I'm young or that my species is relatively new to space travel doesn't make the mathematics any less valid. He gestured to the equations still glowing in the holographic display. These relationships have been confirmed by experimental evidence from laboratories across the galaxy. They've been peer-reviewed by scientists from every major Federation species. They form the foundation for technologies that we use every day, from quantum computers to faster-than-light communication systems. Marcus paused, gathering his courage for what he knew would be the most important part of his presentation. Professor Zekthara, you've described human science as primitive and suggested that our understanding is somehow inferior to established galactic principles. But the evidence shows that human scientists have independently discovered the same fundamental relationships that every other advanced species has found. We've approached these discoveries from a different cultural and technological background, but we've arrived at the same mathematical truths. He manipulated the display one final time, showing a comprehensive comparison of quantum mechanical principles as understood by different species. This is what scientific progress looks like, diverse perspectives converging on universal truth. The Academy exists to facilitate this process, to bring together the best minds from across the galaxy regardless of their species or background. Marcus looked out at the assembled audience, needing the eyes of his classmates and professors. I'm not asking anyone to take my word for any of this. I'm asking you to examine the evidence, review the mathematics, and reach your own conclusions based on scientific rigor rather than preconceived notions about species hierarchy. Dr. Morthek nodded approvingly. Mr. Chen, your presentation has been both comprehensive and compelling. Professor Zekthara, you now have 30 minutes to present your counterargument. Professor Zekthara rose from his seat, his considerable height making him an imposing figure as he approached the podium. Marcus stepped aside, his heart pounding as he realized that his entire future now depended on how well he'd made his case. Honored panel members, Professor Zekthara began, I want to address the fundamental issue that has been obscured by Mr. Chen's impressive display of research and rhetoric. This is not ultimately a question about quantum mechanics or mathematical relationships. This is about proper academic conduct and the importance of maintaining appropriate respect for institutional authority. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Rather than engaging with the scientific evidence, Professor Zekthara was going to focus on his behavior in class. Mr. Chen disrupted my classroom, challenged my expertise in front of other students, and displayed a level of arrogance that is unbecoming of any student, particularly one from a junior species still learning to participate in galactic civilization. Professor Zekthara activated his own holographic display, showing Academy policies regarding student conduct and respect for faculty authority. The proper response to perceived disagreement with a professor is to request a private meeting, submit questions through appropriate channels, or seek clarification through additional study. It is not to engage in public confrontation or to suggest that centuries of established academic practice should be overturned to accommodate the perspective of a single student. Marcus watched in growing dismay as Professor Zekthara built his case around procedural violations rather than scientific accuracy. It was a clever strategy. Even if Marcus was right about the science, he had clearly violated Academy protocols by arguing with a professor in class. Furthermore, Professor Zekthara continued, while Mr. Chen's research has been thorough, it misses a crucial point about the nature of scientific education. The Academy doesn't exist simply to validate whatever theories students happen to bring from their home worlds. It exists to provide systematic, rigorous education based on the accumulated wisdom of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations. Professor Zekthara's four eyes swept the audience. Mr. Chen's species has been part of the galactic community for barely 15 years. While human curiosity and enthusiasm are admirable qualities, they cannot substitute for the deep understanding that comes from centuries of scientific development and peer review. Marcus felt a surge of anger at the dismissive tone, but he forced himself to remain calm. Professor Zekthara was making exactly the kind of argument that Marcus had hoped to counter, the idea that scientific truth should be subordinated to academic hierarchy and species prejudice. The mathematical relationships that Mr. Chen has described are indeed well-established principles of quantum mechanics, Professor Zekthara continued, but his presentation fundamentally misunderstands how scientific knowledge is properly transmitted and validated within an educational institution. Marcus's heart sank further. Professor Zekthara was essentially conceding the scientific point while arguing that it didn't matter because Marcus had gone about presenting it the wrong way. When I suggested that Mr. Chen focus on established galactic principles rather than human theories, I was not questioning the validity of the underlying mathematics. I was attempting to guide him toward a more sophisticated understanding of how these principles fit within the broader context of galactic scientific tradition. That was news to Marcus. In class, Professor Zekthara had seemed to be dismissing human science entirely, not trying to provide broader context. However, Professor Zekthara continued, Mr. Chen chose to interpret my guidance as prejudice against his species, leading to the unfortunate confrontation that has brought us here today. Marcus realized that Professor Zekthara was trying to reframe the entire incident, making it seem like a simple misunderstanding rather than a fundamental disagreement about scientific authority and species prejudice. In conclusion, Professor Zekthara said, while I appreciate Mr. Chen's enthusiasm for scientific discovery, his behavior in my classroom was inappropriate and disruptive. The proper resolution is not to validate this behavior by overturning established academic protocols, but to provide Mr. Chen with additional guidance on how to participate constructively in advanced scientific education. Professor Zekthara returned to his seat, leaving Marcus feeling like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. The Vorthak professor had effectively sidestepped the entire scientific argument by focusing on procedural violations and reframing his original position as reasonable guidance rather than species prejudice. Dr. Morthek called for a brief recess while the panel deliberated, and Marcus found himself surrounded by his classmates. To his surprise, many of them seemed supportive. That was incredible research, Veltar said, the KRYLL's crystalline structure glowing with what Marcus had learned indicated respect. I had no idea that our species had discovered the same relationships independently. Sirash, the Nexary student, rippled with agreement. Professor Zekthara's response felt like he was moving the goalposts. First he said you were wrong about the science, now he's saying you were right but went about it wrong. Yeah, added Thix, the young Gornath, but he kind of has a point about proper academic procedure. You did argue with him in front of the whole class. Marcus nodded reluctantly. I know. I should have handled it differently. But how do you politely disagree when a professor is essentially saying your entire species is too primitive to understand real science? Maybe, said a new voice, the problem isn't with how you disagreed, but with the fact that such disagreement was necessary in the first place. Marcus turned to see Dr. Vel Shannon, his theoretical engineering professor, approaching their group. Her presence was both encouraging and terrifying. Faculty members didn't usually involve themselves in student disputes. Dr. Vel Shannon, Marcus said nervously, I didn't expect to see you here. Mr. Chen, your presentation today was exemplary. You demonstrated exactly the kind of rigorous, evidence-based reasoning that the Academy is supposed to foster. The fact that you had to defend such basic scientific principles in a formal review is troubling. Before Marcus could respond, Dr. Morthek's voice echoed through the auditorium, calling everyone back for the panel's decision. As Marcus returned to his seat, he tried to prepare himself for disappointment. Professor Zekthara's strategy had been effective. Even if Marcus was right about the science, he had violated Academy protocols by challenging a professor publicly. The panel would likely find some compromise position that validated the science while censuring Marcus's behavior. Dr. Morthek stood at the center of the panel table, his ancient Gornath features grave with the weight of decision. After careful consideration of both presentations and review of relevant Academy policies and scientific literature, this panel has reached a unanimous conclusion. Marcus held his breath. First, regarding the scientific accuracy of the claims made by Mr. Chen, the mathematical relationships described in what humans call Bell's theorem are indeed fundamental principles of quantum mechanics that have been independently discovered and verified by multiple species throughout the galaxy. Mr. Chen's assertion that these represent universal scientific truth rather than species-specific interpretation is correct. A murmur of surprise went through the audience. Marcus felt a surge of relief and vindication, but Dr. Morthek wasn't finished. Second, regarding the appropriate role of academic authority in scientific discourse, while institutional hierarchy and professional expertise are important factors in educational settings, they cannot supersede the fundamental commitment to scientific truth that forms the foundation of all legitimate academic inquiry. Marcus's relief grew stronger, but he knew there was still the question of his behavior to address. Third, regarding the conduct of both parties in the original classroom incident, after reviewing the complete recordings of the class session in question, this panel finds that Professor Zekthara's characterization of his comments as guidance rather than dismissal is not supported by the evidence. The professor's statements regarding human intellectual capabilities and the validity of human scientific contributions constitute clear examples of species prejudice that have no place in an academic environment. Marcus felt his jaw drop. The panel was actually censuring Professor Zekthara? However, Dr. Morthek continued, Mr. Chen's response, while understandable given the provocation, was not appropriate for a classroom setting. Public confrontation, regardless of the validity of the underlying position, disrupts the educational environment and sets a poor precedent for academic discourse. Here it comes, Marcus thought. The compromise that validates the science while punishing the messenger. Therefore, Dr. Morthek announced, this panel makes the following recommendations. Professor Zekthara will issue a formal apology to Mr. Chen and to the class for his inappropriate comments regarding human intellectual capabilities. He will also undergo additional training on cultural sensitivity and inclusive pedagogy. Marcus could see Professor Zekthara's face darkening with indignation, but the Gornath panel chair wasn't finished. Mr. Chen will continue in his current courses without penalty, but will also participate in a seminar on constructive academic discourse to ensure that future disagreements are handled through appropriate channels. Dr. Morthek's multitudinous eyes surveyed the auditorium. Most importantly, this entire incident will be used as a case study in academy training programs to ensure that all faculty and students understand that scientific truth transcends species boundaries and that the Academy's commitment to intellectual freedom applies equally to all members of our community, regardless of their background or the relative seniority of their civilizations. Principal Mordak stood up, her imposing figure commanding attention. The Academy was founded on the principle that knowledge serves the common good of all Federation species. Today's proceedings have reaffirmed that commitment and demonstrated that when institutional authority conflicts with scientific truth, it is authority that must yield. As the formal session ended and beings began filing out of the auditorium, Marcus found himself surrounded once again by classmates and faculty. The congratulations and expressions of support were overwhelming, but what struck him most was the change in atmosphere. The subtle tension that had characterized his interactions with other students seemed to have evaporated, replaced by genuine respect and acceptance. Professor Zekthara approached him as the crowd thinned, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Marcus tensed, expecting another confrontation. Mr. Chen, the Vortak professor said quietly, I owe you an apology. Not just the formal one that the panel required, but a genuine acknowledgement that my treatment of you and your contributions was inappropriate and unprofessional. Marcus blinked in surprise. Professor, please, let me finish. Professor Zekthara's 4 eyes showed something that might have been shame. I have spent so much of my career focused on maintaining the reputation and authority of Vortak science that I lost sight of the fundamental truth you demonstrated today, that scientific discovery belongs to all species, and wisdom can emerge from any source. The professor paused, seeming to struggle with his words. Your presentation today reminded me why I became a scientist in the first place, the pursuit of truth, regardless of where that truth might lead or who might discover it first. Marcus felt a complex mixture of emotions: anger at the months of dismissive treatment, satisfaction at being vindicated, but also a surprising amount of sympathy for this professor who was clearly grappling with the implications of his own prejudices. "Professor," Marcus said carefully, "I think we both learned something today. I learned that there are better ways to handle disagreements, and maybe you learned that humans have more to contribute than you initially thought." Professor Zekthera extended one of his elongated hands in what Marcus recognized as the Vorthak gesture of respect between equals. "Mr. Chen, I would be honored if you would consider remaining in my advanced physics class. I believe we could both benefit from the continued exchange of perspectives." As Marcus shook the professor's hand, he realized that this moment represented something much larger than his own academic vindication. It was a demonstration that the Academy's founding principles weren't just empty rhetoric, but living ideals that could overcome even deeply ingrained prejudices when backed by courage and evidence. Principal Mordak appeared beside them, her multifaceted eyes reflecting what Marcus was certain was approval. "Mr. Chen, I believe you've given the entire Academy community something valuable to think about today." "Ma'am," Marcus replied, "I just presented the evidence and let it speak for itself." "That," Principal Mordak said, "is exactly what good science is supposed to do. And it's exactly why the Academy needs students like you, students who are willing to stand up for truth even when it's difficult or uncomfortable." As Marcus gathered his materials and prepared to leave the auditorium, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just 2 weeks. He'd gone from feeling like an outsider barely tolerated at the galaxy's most prestigious institution to being recognized as a defender of the Academy's fundamental values. But, more importantly, he realized, the entire incident had demonstrated something crucial about humanity's place in the galactic community. They weren't junior partners waiting for permission to contribute. They were full participants in the grand enterprise of scientific discovery, with unique perspectives and valuable insights that deserved respect and consideration. As Marcus walked out of the auditorium and into the bright artificial sunlight of the Academy's main courtyard, he felt a profound sense of belonging for the first time since arriving at the institution. Not because anyone had granted him permission to belong, but because he'd proven through evidence and argument that belonging was his right as a thinking being committed to the pursuit of truth. The Academy's motto, carved in a dozen different languages above the main entrance, caught his eye as he passed: "Knowledge serves all." For the first time since arriving, Marcus truly understood what those words meant, and, more importantly, he understood his own role in making them reality. Tomorrow, he would return to Professor Zekthera's class, but not as a barely tolerated outsider hoping to prove himself worthy. He would return as an equal partner in the ongoing quest to understand the universe, ready to contribute his own unique perspective to the grand conversation that was galactic science. And, if anyone, regardless of their species or status, tried to tell him that humans weren't ready for that conversation, Marcus now knew exactly what he would say: the mathematics don't lie, and truth doesn't care about anyone's prejudices. The galaxy was vast and full of wonders still to be discovered. And humanity, Marcus now knew with certainty, would play a full and equal role in discovering them.